If you're wondering how people become so stupid, how people are so resentful and so angry, this is how it happens. That's why I said it's calcified. It becomes natural. It turns into something that is self-sustaining. The liberalism, the fascism,
we got a lot of work
the liberalism, the fascism pipeline. Okay, we'll start off here. This might be good.
To do. Americans are being squeezed out of the labor force and their jobs are taken. But all over the world, they're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia. And you know who's being hurt the most by millions of people pouring into our country? The black population and the Hispanic population. The crime is going to be tremendous. The unions are suffering because of it. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done.
You would think that at a time when economic stratification and marginalization are running rampant, a time where the rich grow richer at the expense of everyone else, politicians would tailor their rhetoric to tackle the real issues at hand and not just stir division amongst races, genders, creeds, and religions. But no. Why do figures like Donald Trump point the finger at immigrants as though they are the reason for economic instability and not oligarchs? Will he ever mention the fact that in 2022 alone, undocumented migrants paid nearly $100 billion in tax revenue while being shut out of the very programs they helped fund? Why is the blame for a failing economic model rarely placed on the model itself, but instead transferred to groups who are already having a hard enough time? Why does this economic instability lead to divisive in-group, out-group rhetoric?
Link the video of him, or I'm making a call-out video about you on TikTok. What? Oh, CCP Philosophy might have done one? Okay, that might be the video that I was thinking, yeah. Friend of the show, Overzealous' video, Liberalism, the Fascism Pipeline, Neoliberalism Explained.
And not toward a productive discussion about the innate instability of the economic model we live under. I hope I can answer that question by the end of this video. But first, we have to go back in time just a bit.
CCK Philosophy.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, Western governments and economists alike were scratching their heads trying to come up with economic reforms that would prevent a calamity like the war they just endured from ever occurring again. The Great Depression still lingered in the minds of many, with unregulated capitalism widely seen as its cause and an unstable economic model. Western governments didn't want to scrap capitalism altogether, but they believed that by guaranteeing their populations basic dignities and social safety nets, it would prevent them from entertaining alternative economic and political ideas. Keep in mind, it was the disillusionment and suffering of the German citizenry post-World War I that allowed for Hitler's rhetoric and ideas to flourish. By preventing that level of economic instability from occurring again, Western governments believed that they could prevent fascism from gaining traction in the future. They also wished to prevent socialist or communist sentiment from strengthening. It's important to note that post-World War II, the socialist bloc was guaranteeing employment, healthcare, and housing to its citizens. If the capitalist West didn't try to appease its populations in a similar way, it feared that revolutionary leftist movements would flourish, and in the eyes of many liberals, fascism and socialism are totally the same level of evil. One for one. And that brings us to this dude, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was an economist who stressed the demand side. To put it very simply, he believed that when people have more money to spend, especially workers who make up most consumers, it drives demand, keeps businesses running, and helps the economy stay healthy. And when that doesn't happen naturally, he argued, the government should step in to boost spending and keep things moving. Think of it as a kinder form of capitalism that Keynes was advocating for, one designed to prevent catastrophes like the Great Depression and keep the economically downtrodden from revolting against their governments. After the Second World War in the 40s and 50s, Keynesian economics began to rise to prominence. Western governments embraced Keynes's ideas and enacted policies that built the foundation for what we now call social democracies. They were done with unfettered capitalism and knew that a mixed social democratic type model was the way to not only keep their populations happier, but keep both fascism and socialism at bay. Because again, those two things are totally morally equivalent. One for one. Now, I have my issues with social democracy. We'll get into that later in this video, but one thing that's for certain is that the social democratic model was an improvement to the unregulated capitalist hellscape that preceded it. As the Western world continued to embrace Keynesian economics and shift toward social democracies, there was a very notable man who was just not with it. This guy, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was an Austrian economist who believed that an overemphasis on collectivism would fast-track a society to totalitarianism. He believed that social democracy and expansive welfare states would erode the individual and eventually morph into authoritarianism. In 1944, Hayek published a book called The Road to Serfdom, in which he made his argument, and it did not take long before this book of his was picked up by business communities and wealthy, powerful people who saw his ideas as a way to champion a reversal of the Keynesian era. While Keynesian economics improved financial stability for the average person, the ultra-rich resented it because it limited their ability to maximize profits. The business communities and the ultra-rich saw in Hayek's ideas a chance to reverse labor protections, taxes, regulations, and usher the world back into an era where unfettered capitalism ruled supreme, an era where they could grow their wealth exponentially without having to worry about who or what they exploited. But convincing the world of an ideology that is objectively dog shit just because it would be friendly to the rich and powerful wasn't easy. This was going to take a lot of money and resources, so rich, moneyed interests immediately got to work promoting Hayek's book. DeWitt Wallace, the anti-communist editor and founder of Reader's Digest, published a condensed version of Hayek's book in an attempt to make his ideas more digestible for casual readers. 1 million reprints were ordered, many of which were at the requests of companies trying to indoctrinate their workers. Look magazine adapted Hayek's book into a cartoon, which was distributed by General Motors to its workers, and Hayek was being booked for well-paying speaking gigs in America, so his
Thanks for watching, Hassan. Hell yeah, Overzealots, another banger.
ideas could be propagated further. In 1947, Hayek went on to found the Mont Pelerin Society, which was an organization where he and other like-minded individuals went on to promote his theories of free market, deregulated capitalism. The ideas propagated by Hayek and his organization have come to be referred to as neoliberalism, and this doctrine of his was financially backed by some of the richest, most powerful interests on Earth. Forces such as the Koch brothers, William Volcker & Co., General Electric, DuPont, and many, many more.
What was the second thought one on Nazi Germany? If there's a second thought one, then is the second thought video this one? Were the Nazis socialist? I think this is the one that I was thinking of, right?
Saw in Hayek's neoliberalism a way to liberate themselves from the regulations and responsibilities that Keynesianism imposed on.
For the record, ironically enough, this kind of neoliberal attitude only works because it's just more in line with the pre-established capitalist hierarchy, okay? It's ironically what the Nazis claimed the Frankfurt School was doing in the socialist direction, but it doesn't work in that way if there isn't enough material instability that is ripe for revolutionary sentiment. You can't just educate people in the direction of socialism under a well-established capitalist organization of the economy, like right now in this time and place, in a place like the United States of America. It is virtually impossible to just like make enough movies or make enough art or movies or educate people in the direction of socialism. You can do that to instill revolutionary consciousness, instill class consciousness. Having said that, you can't just like undermine and destroy the pre-existing hierarchy just from, movies and art and cinema and culture and education. You can, however, do this with think tanks and with education. You can move it in the direction of more capitalism, I guess. Not less capitalism. That was the opposite of what the Frankfurt School was doing. Well, that was the opposite of what the Frankfurt School was doing. Okay, for the record, the Frankfurt School's intentions or what they were doing in general is only appropriate for the time frame that it existed under, when there was enough material instability and a shit ton of organizing in the direction of socialism, communism, when trade unions were significantly more powerful. And the reasons as to why they were significantly more powerful are both because of the assembly line and because of the way that commodities were being created. Like commodity production. Adorno and Horkheimer leftists thought revolution was going to come from music. Yeah, my point is that even if there was any kind of class consciousness that you could instill upon the public through education and through art or through culture or whatever, that would only work in a situation where people are working side by side in assembly lines and the commodity production is not so globalized in the way that it is now. That's why I always say that in the United States of America, for example, it's very difficult to organize, and it's very difficult because like the capitalist structures that we exist under are so calcified at this point. People take it for granted. People are like, this is the only way. That's why Fisher famously said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, because absolutely zero people can even, like zero normies can envision a future where capitalism is no longer the existing hierarchy. All of capitalism's enemies have been killed. The anti-capitalist sentiment has been effectively squashed, and successful methods of organizing have been destroyed as well. So for that reason, there isn't even for that reason, and because we don't have for those reasons that I mentioned, and because we don't have a old school way of developing commodities, an old school way of producing commodities like they used to back then when everyone was side by side and the material conditions were significantly worse for the average person, there's no effective way of just like creating effective methods of organizing. That's why I do what I do right now to the best of my ability, which is to try to get people to become more aware of their class position. Because Americans are, at the end of the day, far too comfortable. And beyond that, there's no alternative that is presented to them at all. They don't even think about it. Like, it's just outside of the question.
When it comes to
Frankfurt School scholar here, PhD, agree with your assessment on the ground conditions, but the school was also creating new language for all the humanities, creating intellectual conditions for a future movement that could deliver on the promise of socialism. Yeah. My point is, intellectual thought could only unlock the revolutionary potential of the working class. But without organizing and without mechanisms of pushback, without labor militancy, you cannot achieve that on its own. Capitalism has evolved throughout the years. It's gotten lifelines over and over again through the welfare state, through both suppression of dissent, but also through, I think more importantly, the expansive bounties that the labor aristocracy gets, that they take for granted, that they don't even question how they get it. That's the issue with even social democracies to begin with, because the Western world and liberal social democracies could not exist without hyper exploitation of the global South. It just would not exist in the way that it does. So yes, atomization of labor is huge and understated too. That's what I was trying to say. But you put it into better words than myself. Like, we are so hyper connected online and yet so far away from the people that we work alongside at every aspect of production. There's no, like, think about it. I'm technically a wage I'm technically a 1099 wage employee for Twitch, right? This entire structure is built on top of a completely globalized and completely financialized economy, where the computer that I'm using gets its different parts from different parts of the world, with laborers that I will never encounter, laborers that I will never see. The minerals necessary to build some of these things that are inside of the computer is mined in horrifying conditions of hyper exploitation, with, again, faceless figures that I will never encounter. And then when you think about Amazon in of itself as a ginormous corporation, and even the workers that work within Twitch or the AWS structure, I don't know where they live around the planet. I don't know how they work. I don't know what their working conditions look like. And all of that system is what allows me to do what I'm doing right now. Whereas back in the day, I think like commodity production was much simpler. Sure, there was still resource extraction happening in other parts of the world, but you know, you worked at a factory where you went in every single day to that factory and you were standing next to other people on the assembly line. It was much easier to organize in a process like that. One, because they did not have the Amazon methods of disrupting labor organizing, right? In the way that like Amazon distribution facilities, which would be the closest to that assembly line structure, but you know, Amazon does a lot of turnover deliberately in an effort to make sure that no one is there for more than 2 years. Because if you know your comrades really well, inevitably you're going to start recognizing that they have the same pains that you do. Every day that you spend in those conditions is another day where you recognize that your managers are actually antagonistic towards you. That creates class consciousness. This entire system is designed in a way where we are so far away from other laborers that have similar perspectives, similar needs, similar wants. It's also partially why right-wing reactionary sentiment that is inherently divisive is so successful
on them. Now, neoliberalism as a term in the modern day tends to be used mostly as a pejorative by people critical of the ideology, but it absolutely still is a real and pervasive parasitic force. To define it can be tricky, but here are a few attempts that I think do a good job. Historian David Harvey says, neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. If markets do not exist in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, or environmental pollution, then they must be created by state action if necessary. But beyond these tasks, the state should not venture. Deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common. George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison define neoliberalism as an ideology whose central belief is that competition is the defining feature of humankind. It tells us that we are greedy and selfish, but that greed and selfishness light the path to social improvement, generating the wealth that will eventually enrich us all. It casts us as consumers rather than citizens. It seeks to persuade us that our well-being is best realized not through political choice, but through economic choice, specifically buying and selling. It promises us that by buying and selling, we can discover a natural meritocratic hierarchy of winners and losers. The market, it contends, will, if left to its own devices, determine who deserves to succeed and who does not. The talented and hardworking will prevail, whereas the feckless, weak, and incompetent will fail. The wealth the winners generate will trickle down to enrich the rest. Neoliberals argue that an active state seeking to change social outcomes through public spending and social programs rewards failure, fuels dependency, and subsidizes the losers. The role of governments, neoliberals claim, should be to eliminate the obstacles that prevent the discovery of the natural hierarchy. Put very simply, neoliberalism is the ideology that clears the way for unfettered capitalism to rule supreme. As you can probably tell, this is the perfect ideology for the ultra-rich to get behind because not only does it frame financial success as purely meritocratic, but it also paints monetary gain as some sort of moral accomplishment that the state should by no means interfere with, even if that gain is achieved through exploitation or injustice. It treats the market as a wholly infallible force that rewards the strong and worthy, while ignoring the fact that markets are indifferent to human suffering. Since this market fundamental
The one note that I'll put on this is that neoliberalism does not care about market interference at all, as long as it is done at the behest of private enterprise, the unleashing of the markets, if you will. So technically, it's not just like laissez-faire across the board. neoliberals will often interfere in markets, but they will interfere in markets to open up the floodgates of free enterprise, to private enterprise. Neoliberalism also says you can have an authoritarian dictatorship. Pinochet is a great example of this, where it is much more preferable to have an authoritarian dictator manage the economy in a way that benefits the private sector. He might have said all of that right here, but I was pissing.
Capitalism is a key component of the ideology. Markets are often forced into sectors where they shouldn't be. This ideology, in an almost Calvinist sense, allows for the rich and powerful to reframe their opulence and greed as moral and just. It allows corporate interests to ignore those pesky market externalities, to forget about the pollution and exploitation their operations create, because if the free market rewards them with riches, then they must be on the right path. No wonder the ruling class jumped. Like
Obama 2008, in the aftermath of the market crash, the numerous times where bailouts have been given to Boeing. These are fundamental aspects of neoliberal enterprise. They make it seem as though this is supposed to be corporatism. It's something different, but like, no, it's not. That is exactly how it's supposed to work. Yeah, Milton Friedman openly said he preferred a dictatorship with economic liberalism versus a democracy without that.
Jumped at the opportunity to push Hayek's ideas. But again, they were faced with the obstacle of democracy. Neoliberalism, to most normal people, is not a very enticing ideology, and they sure as wouldn't vote for it if they knew what it was.
Despite the millions of dollars that went into promoting the ideas of Hayek and his cohort,
Keynesian economics remained as the mainstream economic consensus, but that was soon to change. The neoliberals knew that it would be hard to implement their policies domestically without first testing them out abroad, and the country that they set their sights on was Chile. Throughout the Cold War, the US government was very involved in Chile. They did not want it to turn communist, and they did everything they could to exert economic and political influence over it. The US even brought Chilean university students to America to study economics at the University of Chicago because it had a reputation for being anti-left. This operation came to be known as the Chile Project, and as author Naomi Klein put it, the goal of the Chile Project was to produce ideological warriors who would win the battle of ideas against Latin America's pink economists. As this battle was taking place,
there's never been a moment where this kind of stuff has not been enforced without violence, by the way. There's no peaceful pathway towards like getting Chile to recognize the entrepreneurial spirit. It might seem like it now in the aftermath of many, many decades, if not half a century of direct violence, and then the additional subsequent violence that comes after you place your dictator in a position of power, where you slowly but surely erode civil liberties and erode even the alternative pathways to a successful socialist revolution. At a point where it basically becomes like a self-sustaining mechanism, in the same ways where in the United States of America, for example, you see a lot of backlash organically develop against socialist thought and any sort of anti-capitalist sentiment. Or if you're wondering how people become so stupid, how people are so resentful and so angry towards a different organization of the economy that they've never actually encountered, one that actually, in theory, at the very least, directly benefits their living conditions, this is how it happens. That's why I said it's calcified. It becomes natural, and therefore it turns into something that is self-sustaining, where the government doesn't have to actively interfere in these events, especially if they've completely eroded any sort of mechanism of pushback in the form of destroying labor unions, for example.
Place on the ideological front, Chile, in 1970, had elected a socialist leader, which was not gonna fly with the Americans. The US spent millions of dollars and used every available resource to destabilize Chile and create the conditions for a coup. They wanted that pesky leftist out so they could replace him with someone else and test out neoliberalism. In 1973, that wish came true. Chile's Marxist president was overthrown and replaced by a military junta, which eventually consolidated under the rule of Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet was a brutal dictator whose fascistic regime was marked by mass murder, torture, violence, kidnappings, and the persecution of leftists. He rid the country of any socialist or Marxist influence, and in the eyes of the Americans, he was the perfect man to implement neoliberalism in Chile. Those same students who studied economics at the University of Chicago were now fully equipped to return home and put their lessons of mass privatization, deregulation, and market fundamentalism into practice. University of Chicago professor Milton Friedman played a key role in indoctrinating these young men, and he was also a prominent member of Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society. Remember that? As the years passed under Pinochet's brutal dictatorship, Chile's wealthy elite thrived, along with American corporations which were free to exploit Chilean resources without the threat of nationalization or government regulation. Pinochet allowed them to operate without restrictions, and if the Chilean population had a problem with that, he would kill or torture them into compliance. Nothing was to get in the way of the almighty invisible hand of the free market. Friedrich Hayek even had this to say about Pinochet's Chile: "My personal preference leans toward a liberal dictatorship rather than toward a democratic government devoid of liberalism." Need I remind you, this guy built his entire career by fear-mongering about how welfare programs were a slippery slope to tyranny. But as soon as he was faced with a tyrannical despot who just so happened to promote his economics, suddenly all that talk about freedom and liberty wasn't so convenient, and he didn't mind a dictatorship all too much, as long as it was, quote, a liberal one. Unlike the corporatist blend of state and business seen in fascist regimes of old, such as Mussolini's Italy, Pinochet's regime maintained the hyper-militaristic, ultra-nationalist authoritarianism intrinsic to fascism, but repurposed the state to clear the way for corporate dominance. This model has laid the groundwork for what some have referred to as neoliberal fascism. Which brings me to one of the main points of this video. Free market economics and fascistic regimes are not mutually exclusive.
They go hand in hand throughout history.
As we can see, fascistic despots like Pinochet were propped up solely to protect capital, exploit labor, and enforce what Hayek would call liberalism. By that point, Hayek had distanced himself from the term neoliberalism due to its...
That was an example of like obvious foreign interference, which was a necessity in the minds of capitalists for a place like Chile at the time, because the people were demanding change in the socialist direction. But this also happens without foreign interference in countries that are somewhat sovereign, right? Nation states that are sovereign, or at least like what you would understand as a sovereign established nation state. The reason why I'm making that distinction is because I'm thinking of Germany and I'm comparing it to an established nation state like the United States of America, with no outside interference that can technically disrupt it or destroy it or push it in the same way that this like large, powerful country like the United States of America could do to Chile. So in the absence of that foreign enemy and foreign interference, you arrive at economic instability, economic volatility, and how that creates, or even like the unfettered greed in the United States of America that has caused so much wealth inequality and so much economic instability that there needs to be some kind of control, some kind of enforcement to not necessarily breathe life back into capitalism, but to ensure that the capitalist order remains. And that is precisely where we're at in the United States of America, where when contradictions heighten under a capitalist organization of the economy, and these contradictions are baked into the system, and welfare expansion or some additional benefits programs and whatnot are not enough, or there's no appetite to do so, there's no appetite to even deliver those projects, it inevitably erodes into barbarism, fascism. Fascism is the tool to make sure that the natural disruption that comes from the contradictions within capitalism are maintained, are destroyed, are squashed by force. It is a way to maintain the status quo of capitalism.
Its negative connotations, and just went with liberalism or classical liberalism. So now that the Chile project was complete and neoliberalism was proven to treat the ruling class quite well, it was time to bring it home to the West in the forms of Reaganism in the US and Thatcherism in the UK. I should note that neoliberal policies did technically start up under Carter, which is why some people say Reaganism came before Reagan, but it wasn't until Ronald came around that the full ferocity of neoliberalism would be unleashed in the US. I think we all know what Reaganism is: the heavy emphasis on supply-side economics, mass privatizations, deregulations, attacks on labor protections, and the whole neoliberal 9 yards. A similar set of policies was enacted in Britain under Thatcher when she privatized the railways and other public utilities, implemented the poll tax, sold off public housing to private interests, privatized the prison system, and so on. These economic reforms, by prioritizing the business communities and the rich, we were told, would deliver a tide that would lift all boats. But in reality, to quote David Harvey, neither Britain nor the US achieved high levels of economic performance in the 80s, suggesting that neoliberalism was not the answer to the capitalists' prayers. To be sure, inflation was brought down and interest rates fell, but this was all purchased at the expense of high rates of unemployment.
You said, how are they disorganized? This is why people believe in the Illuminati. That's ironic because this is why anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. The Illuminati is usually a substitute for the other, right? And it's usually, depending on how far down the rabbit hole you've fallen, they just mean Jews, right? The permanent other. Now, ironically enough, all of this stuff is above board. It's not happening in dark, shadowy rooms. It's happening at the Davos summit. It's happening at G10. It's not happening secretly. It's not happening in under the shroud of secrecy. It's happening in broad daylight. And because a lot of this stuff is just purely motivated by class interest, and billionaires, millionaires, and the capitalist class is very well aware of their class position, okay, in ways that the working class certainly is not. They organize. They have all the power. They have all the money, and they have for generations designed society in a way that there are brave little warriors that will do their bidding amongst the working class. People who are ideologically invested in the continuation of capitalism, even if their class position means that they will suffer under capitalism. That's how it works. That's why you see so many people do this for free in this chat all the time. That's why I always ask, like, show me the pay stubs. Where's your factory? You claim to be a capitalist, and yet you are devoid of capital. Where is the deed to your factory that you're defending so hard? You don't. People say, Hassan, you claim to be a socialist, and yet you are rich. And it's like, okay, well, you claim to be a capitalist, but you're broke as. Why are you broke and defending capitalism while yelling at me for not doing so? Even when you also recognize it's beneficial for me, dumbass. So the demand always feels like just say things that are beneficial for you, please, sir. Please, master. Please, master. Why do you not defend just like the other ones? My other lords defend it. Why don't you defend it? It makes no sense.
Averaging 7.5% in the US during the Reagan years, and more than 10% in Thatcher's Britain. Cutbacks in state welfare and infrastructural expenditures diminished the quality of life for many. The overall result was an awkward mix of low growth and increasing income inequality. But none of that actually mattered because the real goal in both instances was to facilitate the transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. The relentless privatizations and the creation of markets any and everywhere did the trick. One aspect of this neoliberal transformation that often gets ignored is the think tanks funded by dark money that actually come up with these policies that then get handed to governments. To quote Monbiot and Hutchison, we've discovered that the Koch brothers, two of the richest people in human history, developed an entire network of think tanks to lobby for extreme neoliberalism.
They also invented the Tea Party, okay? Whole cloth, like the Tea Party movement. Not bad.
In Reagan's case, the Mandate for Leadership was a 3,000-page document written by the Heritage Foundation, the same force behind today's Project 2025, that was given to Reagan and entailed thousands of policy prescriptions that ranged from mass privatizations, the scaling back of welfare programs, massive tax cuts for the rich, and so on. We begin to see how this ideology, heavily funded by the ultra-rich, serves the ultra-rich without any concern for democracy. The more governments deregulate, privatize, and implement neoliberal policies, the richer the ruling class becomes, and the more they can exert their influence over politicians and governments. In capitalist democracies, money serves as voting power. The more of it you have, the more of the vote share you effectively control. Neoliberalism seeks to break the chains that restrict unfettered capitalism, and as a result, it breeds plutocrats and oligarchs, not democracy. It's very easy to point the finger at Reagan and Thatcher, but the idea that it started and stopped with them distracts us from the fact that the same plutocratic forces behind their administrations are still around today, and they don't just back conservatives or Republicans. Everyone is a neoliberal now. Some of the most grotesque displays of neoliberalism often come from Democrats, Canadian Liberals, UK Labour, and similar parties. From Bill Clinton's repeal of FDR's Glass-Steagall Act, legislation designed to regulate the financial sector, the revocation of which played a role in the 2008 financial crash.
Glass-Steagall. Hype Train Level 5, Salicon, thank you for the 25 big ones after Bubblegum Bunny Girl's 100 big ones. God damn. We are all neoliberals now. Yes, neoliberalism is the hegemonic force of existence. It is the culture. It is everything. It is all of our politics. This is it. Post-Carter, every president has continued along with this agenda. That's why I always say everyone's a liberal.
To Tony Blair taking a neoliberal hatchet to the UK's beloved National Health Service, these displays of neoliberalism should not go unmentioned. And this brings me back to the question I asked at the start of this video. Why is it that instead of blaming the neoliberals running our failing economic system, the blame always gets dumped on marginalized groups? And the answer is simple. Because when we're conditioned to believe that hard work guarantees success, that the so-called winners and
the lie of meritocracy, another key plank of pro-capitalist propaganda, capitalism propaganda, the myth of meritocracy, the notion that if you work hard and you work smart, that you will get yours. Okay? You cannot overcome probability. I'm sorry. And the very few that do, I mean, there's no one that overcomes probability. That's not a real thing. Like, that's not. Anyone and everyone that has actually reached the point of success that they've reached under this current organization of the economy have reached that point due to luck. Did they work hard? Absolutely. Did they work smart? Absolutely. But they got a genuine large amount of luck, myself included. If meritocracy was real, then Elon Musk wouldn't exist. Like Elon Musk, who spends every waking moment tweeting and not really doing anything other than just be a rich guy who sits on top of multiple businesses at this point. Why the f is he the wealthiest guy on the planet? Did he work harder and smarter than everybody else? No, of course not. It's mathematically impossible for him to work harder and smarter than every single person. There's not enough hours in the day. There's not enough brain advantage for someone like Elon Musk to acquire that level of wealth. It's just literally impossible. Okay? It is physically impossible. It's not a thing that you can do.
Overachievers will naturally rise and reap the rewards. It's a lot easier to scapegoat and outgroup when that promise falls apart than to question the system itself. It's reassuring to believe.
Yeah, if meritocracy was real, my father would be on the board of Ford, but he's still paycheck to paycheck after 4.5 decades of working for them. Exactly.
That all we need to do to live a fruitful life is work hard. But those who were told to work hard did work hard, and oftentimes found the results underwhelming. This creates an opening for fascistic, divisive rhetoric and strong men to rise to power. We saw this with Trump, who blamed everything on immigrants and the swamp, but once he was in office, he did nothing but serve the same corporate interests. He slashed taxes for the wealthy, he boasts a horrendous anti-labor record, and on his last day of his first presidential term, he rescinded Executive Order 13770, lifting restrictions that had made it more difficult for government officials to transition between public office and the private sector, particularly in terms of lobbying. After all that talk about draining the swamp, we were left with an even more corrupt corporate shill who used populist rhetoric to stoke hatred and distract us from the real enemy, Neoliberalism.
Do neolibs actually believe this, or they just pretend? Yes, of course they believe it. What do you mean? It is infinitely easier for someone like myself who has achieved a real amount of success under this current organization, the economy, to say, yeah, I got here because I worked hard, baby, because I'm brilliant, because I worked smart and I worked hard. No, people in positions of power truly believe that they earned it. They earned it through blood, sweat, and tears. They earned it through their work. They worked hard. They worked smart. And the saddest part about it is that people who are not in those positions, people who do not actually have any capital whatsoever, also believe that those guys earned it. That's why I always compare like capitalism to the exact same motivating principles under that maintained theocratic monarchies. That's why I always joke about the peasant brain. Right? When I say like these guys have serf brains, this is what I'm talking about. Why is the king the king? Because God told all of us. God controls every aspect of our lives, and God said he's supposed to be the chosen one. He's supposed to lead. And every facet of society was regurgitating that propaganda at the time, and every institution that had any semblance of power had that power because they worked not to overthrow the existing hierarchy, but to defend it. All the lords were also chosen by the king that was chosen by God. Meritocracy is that same lie. Now, in the absence of this association with God, we have to think about meritocracy. Meritocracy is that lie that holds everything together. It's the glue that holds everything together.
Liberalism. If you think this video is going to end with me calling for a return to Keynesian economics or a push towards social democracy, then you would be mistaken. Social democracy would undoubtedly improve the lives of many people living within it, but it does not adequately address the underlying issue. It's still capitalism, and therefore it is still animated by the profit motive and not human well-being. If we look back at the era where Keynesian economics ruled supreme, say in the US for instance, yes, the quality of life domestically was better. However, it's very easy to forget the fact that that way of life was paid for with the blood and sweat of the developing world. Capitalism, fundamentally, is a system founded on colonial looting and the transformation of natural resources into private property. As President Eisenhower was blessing his population with a 91% top marginal tax rate and a 52% corporate tax rate, his administration was overthrowing democratically elected leaders in Guatemala, Iran, and more, just to turn those countries into outposts where American interests could siphon away the wealth and exploit the labor and resources. So yes.
This is why, this is the extent of social democracy, where social democracy offers a lifeline to capitalist exploitation and capitalists in general. But we don't even need to dream about that future in America, because obviously unfettered greed has created an environment where these guys don't even want to do that anymore. Like old libertarians used to call welfare riot tax, okay? Because they understand that if people's material conditions worsen to such a degree that they will fucking riot. They will violently overthrow their masters. Nowadays, as that riot tax erodes to make way for super profits, they're looking for an alternative vision now. They're looking at a different way of enforcing control, making sure that dissent is suppressed. But the conditions are terrible now. Why don't we riot? It's not bad enough. It's not bad enough yet. As long as you still have your treats at a relatively affordable manner, then you're not there yet.
Although he was taxing the rich domestically and funding social programs, we often forget about all the exploitation abroad that Keynesianism or social democracies not only fail to address, but oftentimes thrive off of. Social democracy is essentially a compromise. It occurs when a capitalist state, often through tripartite negotiations, brings labor and capital together to strike a deal while emphasizing social programs and safety nets. The issue with this is that capital is still the force with all the real political pull. If capitalists decide to claw back workers' gains because their margins are looking a little thin, the state will have to side with them or else risk things like capital strikes. In practice, social democracies are still beholden to private interests. We can see in some of the Nordic countries today this very phenomenon occurring. Sweden is clawing back a lot of its social democratic policies and spiking on the Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality. So, although social democracies are preferable to neoliberalism, and although I consider social democrats friends of mine, I think we can do a little better. Social democracy, at the end of the day, is still capitalism. The plunder of the third world will be and has been at the heart of the capitalist mode of production.
Yeah, and as long as capitalism remains, imperialism will also remain as well. There's no way to continue capitalism without consistently enslaving the global south. Just not anything you can do. And that structure exists at the domestic level as well. That's how social democracies fall apart at the domestic level too, because capitalism is endless greed. So no matter how hard you try to regulate it, ultimately those with a tremendous amount of power are going to turn around and force deregulation down the line, force austerity down the line.
For centuries, all the neoliberal era did was bring some of that exploitation back home.
Hayır.
When I talk about liberalism leading to fascism, it's not because I think all the ideas from liberal thinkers or the Enlightenment era are bad. I don't. Concepts like empiricism, anti-dogmatism, rationality, and freedom are great. However, the economic model that emerged from the Enlightenment era was capitalism, which I believe jeopardizes the very principles I just mentioned. Whether it takes the form of Keynesian liberalism, where the majority of the burden is placed on the developing world, or neoliberalism, where that suffering makes its way back home, the embrace of capitalism by liberals will lead to the demise of the very ideals of freedom and democracy they claim to uphold. We've seen this in Pinochet's Chile, where the interests of capital were protected by violence. We've seen it during the Reagan-Thatcher era, where the will of moneyed interests began to brazenly take priority over the will of the majority. It's not what a healthy democracy is supposed to look like.
It's a great video by Overzealots. Incredible channel. Anne, buradan istediğiniz bir şey var mı? Sor Murat'a, al. Buradan istediğiniz bir şey varsa oradan al, yoksa ben sipariş vereceğim. Ondan sonra siz ne istiyorsanız alın. Ama çabuk, ne olur, acım. Oh my god. My whole family is here, so they're like it's